Alright, y'all, we're moving into chapter 13 today on architecture. This is going to be the last chapter. We'll do one more video with a review for the final exam, but we're moving into the content here today on structural systems, so buildings that we see around us. And the chapter has broken this system of architecture up into two basic systems. One is the shell system using one material. So think about ancient temples all being constructed out of stone, or even in a more modern sense, the log cabin, using one material to be the walls, the support, and everything. The skeleton and skin system we really don't see starting to come about until the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s. It takes over in the 20th century. So thinking about more modern skyscrapers using two materials, one being for support, a skeleton like steel, and then using a separate material to make the skin or the sheathing on the outside of that structure, like glass in the case of skyscrapers. But we must consider two main factors whenever we're talking about an architectural structure: the weight of the material that it's being constructed out of, and then also the tensile strength of that material, how much it can support when it's spanning across a distance. This is going to govern what that form looks like. So think about something that has very low tensile strength, like a piece of spaghetti. You can't put much weight on top of it before it breaks. But a piece of steel, for example, has much more tensile strength. You can put a lot of weight on top of that and still have it maintain its form. But before steel and iron construction, going into ancient history, we talk about load-bearing construction, or sometimes as it's referred to, stacking and piling. So think about what we have in this image here, the pyramids that we've been looking at since the beginning of the semester from ancient Egypt. These are examples of stacking and piling, or load-bearing construction. The stones are placed one on top of another, and we're starting to get that inward slant on the walls as it moves up. We never see any of these structures in the form of a skyscraper, for example, that has a right angle in its departure from the surface of the earth. It is important to think about the way that this works. Whenever we have materials that are very heavy like this stone, you have to begin to move it inward as you go upward in height. Otherwise, you risk collapse. The most famous of these structures is the Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest one in the center. And this is a shot from the base of that. If you ever get a chance to go over there, it is not paying the pyramid justice to look at this image. These stones are larger than refrigerators. They're huge, and they compose this surface that we can see looking at the base that is very well put together and almost looks to go on infinitely when you're at the base of the structure itself. I do not recommend doing this. You could possibly get arrested, but as urbex or urban exploration has gotten more popular, people try to get to the top of skyscrapers or bridges and take pictures. In this case, getting on top of one of the lesser pyramids. You can see the Great Pyramid in front of you here in this shot, but someone did make it up to the top there. What you probably also know about the pyramids is that they were looted by grave robbers over the centuries. You can see one of the holes that was excavated here as robbers broke into the pyramid to go in and steal much of the valuable gold and treasures that were buried along with the pharaoh. And we know that that is the use of the pyramid, that the tomb, burial chamber inside of there. We found a separate chamber at this point, but what I want you to be able to see is up here at the top, you've got these pillars that are placed diagonally, so they are resting against one another, And then as you stack more weight on top of that, they're still being able to support a passageway that travels up inside of the pyramid here. So the robbers did get in one of those entrances there, but we have a resemblance here to the Great Pyramid. This is the ziggurat of Ur in modern day Iraq, and what you see here is a little bit of a steeper wall on the outside. This was a stepped pyramid, so there would have been structures built on top of what is left now, just those outside base walls. But you can still see that we have a leaning inward. The best way to get height and make it stable was, instead of building straight up, to start to make those walls lean in so that they are more stable. They don't want to catastrophically fail and collapse outward. This is the rear staircase of the ziggurat, and you can see the structure is composed of much smaller components here. So instead of using massive stones like in the case of the pyramids, we're seeing much smaller bricks that are being used to compose the wall itself. Now, we also see staircases in Mayan examples, so going to Mesoamerica now to look at the Mayan structure at Chichen Itza, which is modern-day Playa del Carmen, Mexico, but we have pyramids, again, with a staircase going up this. So stepping that pyramid in very gradually. We can see when we look at the edge here that there are steps, albeit much smaller than the steps that were in the ziggurat at Ur that we just looked at. But here's a little bit of a comparison to try to be able to see the height of the Great Pyramid compared to one of the Mayan pyramids here. Many times, if you watch too much Ancient Aliens, you'll have people saying that the reason that all these pyramids exist around the world is because aliens were helping these civilizations out, but that is not the case. The physics of building these structures is really what is determining their shape and why they all have a similar resemblance. Stacking and piling. We cannot go up vertically without new materials to be able to help us build structures like we do today. That being iron and steel construction. Using those as a structural support underneath the material. So with these pyramids, what we're seeing is, here is yet another example of that load-bearing construction in action. The Pyramid of the Moon here at Teotihuacan. This is a site that was a metropolis in its day centuries ago. This is north of modern-day Mexico City, and you can still go and visit these ruins. We have a religious site. Rituals are taking place here. We've got ceremonial activity, but also in the surrounding area, we have communities of people that are actually living outside of this center based on their religion. But when we look at, just trying to give you another image overlaying other pyramids that we're familiar with these pyramids themselves. We can see that the Pyramid of the Moon here at Teotihuacan is taking up around the same footprint as the Great Pyramid, but it's nowhere near as tall. This pyramid also is an example of a stepped pyramid, and what is common with Mayan structures is that whenever we're building an initial site, we'll build a smaller pyramid, and then as centuries go by, commission works to make those pyramids larger, build another pyramid on top of it and another pyramid on top of it. And the reason that we know that is because we have excavated down through the strata of these pyramids that were built and seen the structures below there that are still remaining. So this is looking down the main plaza there from the top of the pyramid that was just pictured. And what I really like the most about the Mayan pyramids is that when you go to different sites, so moving from Teotihuacan to the site at Tikal, is that we have the presence of variation in that architectural form. So none of these pyramids look the same. This one at Tikal we see has steps also, but it's much steeper. We have this stairway leading up to a small entrance in the top of the pyramid there. Here is yet another variation in the Mayan building style in El Tahin here. So this one also a stepped pyramid, but we have some window forms that have been built in. Here is the other side of the temple at the site at El Tahin. We have a staircase that you can also see has been built into this structure. But as we move forward in the centuries from the Mayan structures that we still have examples of that we can go and visit to the Aztec site, which is in modern day Mexico City, we do not have this temple. This is an artist's recreation of what the temple looked like based on illustrations from the Europeans after their arrival, but this temple was then destroyed. Much larger than the previous temples that we've been looking at from the Mayans. And the reason that they still know how big the base was because of archaeological excavation that went on during a time when the cathedral in Mexico City in the center began to sink. And during those renovations, they uncovered much of the evidence of this original temple that was placed there. So we've got some artist illustrations here that you can see, again, evidence when we're looking at this pyramid that it was a smaller pyramid that then had a pyramid built over it, and then another pyramid built over it, and even another pyramid. So each time getting larger and larger with the construction. But again, it's a ceremonial site. You have activity being carried out with religious thought here, and many people being able to witness the activities going on at the top of this Temple Mount. Now, here's another mode of construction that we have in the chapter, adobe. And you've probably heard of adobe bricks before. If you've ever been to the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, in the desert climate, adobe is used. And this one is in Mali. We've got a mosque here, so Islamic religion. So what we have here is adobe bricks that are composing the underlying structure. They're dried in the sun and then stacked. And then we have a mud plaster that is applied to the outside of the structure and reapplied every couple of years depending on how much precipitation that we have. And what you can see on the outside, all those little knobs are the wooden understructure that we are using to climb up and reapply that mud plaster. So you might want to make the argument that this is a skeleton and skin system because you have another material here, but the main structural support of the building is being composed of the adobe bricks. So that's where we're getting the one material here. You might also, if you ever go down to the Southwest, this is in the Four Corners region, so the border of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. But we have the site at Mesa Verde that you can still go and visit. And this is the Pueblo people, and they are using adobe bricks for this construction. They've got a really opportune site here that allows them to exist underneath this overhanging cliff, and they've built all of these structures out of bricks. You can gather water, they can bring materials up here, they've got shelter, but this gives you a little bit more of a sense of the scale, and you might be able to, if you look very closely, see the different colors of brick that we have composing all of these walls in the structure. So depending on where they're excavating this material, the adobe for making this mud brick, that's going to affect the color. So some of them are a little darker brown, some of them are a little lighter. But this is still a construction method that we see if you go to the Southwest today with adobe construction. The advantage in the desert is that when you have this massive temperature change from day to night, when the sun is out, the bricks are helping to insulate the home. So at night it'll get cooler, the bricks will get cooler, and then when the sun comes up, those bricks will keep the house cool. As the day goes on and the bricks heat up, when it gets cool at night, it will help to keep the house a little bit warmer than it is outside. So it really helps to control the temperature within those structures. The greatest architectural innovation that comes out of the load-bearing construction period using the shell system is post and lintel. So we're still using one material, but we're coming up with a way that makes it so that we do not have to just build in the form of a pyramid. While we can have very small chambers, like in the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, having the pharaoh's burial chamber inside, the chamber has to be very small, and any passages or hallways that are leading to that chamber also have to be very narrow because of the amount of weight that is stacked on top of the structure. So post and lintel allows us to make our structures a lot more airy, adding windows, doorways, openings, gathering areas underneath. But it's nothing more than using a vertical post and then a horizontal beam, which we're referring to as a lintel that you can see here. And this probably looks familiar because since the beginning of the semester we've also been looking at Stonehenge, a site in England coming from the Neolithic period. Well, this is using post and lintel, as you can see here. We've got vertical posts and then horizontal beams that are added, those lintels on top. So with this in mind, I mean, Stonehenge was not a structure that had a roof. We've looked at it before at the beginning of the semester. It was a ceremonial site. We have ceremonial burials taking place here. But this was a structure that was used to determine the passage of time. Certain stones line up with the solstices, the winter and the summer solstice, the longest and shortest days of the year. It was not something that we see like a temple form, like the Khajuraho monuments in India, that we're using post and lintel to build with. Or in the case of the hypostyle hall, the temple at Luxor here in Egypt, this is a very different style of Egyptian construction. Instead of building with a pyramid, we're building with posts and lintel. So a hypostyle hall implies that you have used post and lintel to create rows of columns and then rows of beams across the top. And then we can add a roof structure over the top of this. So here's just another shot of the temple at Luxor. These columns, the posts themselves, are massive, but they have been constructed by creating a drum system. So if we look very closely at the structures themselves, they're not like the posts at Stonehenge that's just one massive piece of stone, but look up as you go and you'll start to see the seam lines of these drums that are stone cylinders stacked on top of each other that compose these columns here. So you can see it in this one. This is the site at Abu Simbel in the south of Egypt by the Aswan Dam. This temple, you can see it also, the seams of the seams of those drums as the column is stacked. Here is yet another Egyptian temple. This is on the opposite side, the east side of the Nile, where all of your mortuary temples, like this mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, one of the great female pharaohs, she constructed this to house ceremonies for the dead. And we can see post and lintel construction here as well. This colonnade all along the front that has experienced a lot of destruction over the years, having statues, figurative carvings of the pharaohs on the front of those columns, many of which now have been destroyed. But this is what we have left of the temple. And if you look in the back here, You can also see there was a colonnade that supported a roof over this part of the temple here, and much of that also over the centuries has been destroyed. This is a view from the front of that temple, where we can see the grand entryway there and all of those columns, post and lintel construction. This is the same side of the Nile where very close to here we have the Valley of the Kings, which you might have heard of because of the discovery in the early 20th century of the tomb of King Tut, or Tutankhamun. And we can see here a little illustration and an early photograph that we have from Howard Carter going into that tomb, and the help that he has hired, the Egyptians that dug this tomb. So Tutankhamun, remember, was the pharaoh that we looked at in the last chapter when we were talking about enamel on metal, this use of powdered gold to make all of the color on this burial mask. He died when he was just 19 years old, and Howard Carter, as we can see there, being responsible for opening the tomb up, and we can see the layers and layers of sarcophagi that were used to encase his body. So once they opened the main rectilinear sarcophagus here, we see the first sarcophagus of gold in there, which had this sarcophagus inside, which then had another sarcophagus inside, which then, this is not even the original mask that we were looking at. It has yet another sarcophagus on the interior. And this site at the Valley of the Kings, where King Tut is buried, as you can see, also has post and lintel construction there. So this is much later than the pyramids are. This is around 1,000 years after the pyramids were constructed, and post and lintel has now taken over. So using vertical supports, and then as they're digging this tunnel into the hillside to make this burial chamber, because they know that the pyramids are getting robbed by this point, they're using that way. So the Valley of the Kings, there's many sites that are in this area, and they're all constructed in the same way, digging into the hillside and using vertical columns to support the structures here as they're creating this tunnel into the mountain here, decorating it with carvings. So you have low relief carvings, as we talked about in chapter 11 in sculpture, also pigmenting those, so adding paints to make a very vibrant display inside this burial chamber here. But one other structure that we don't want to forget, this is also at the Temple of Luxor here, is the obelisk, which has made its way into our architecture today, thinking about the obelisk as a form of recording, and many of these have been stolen from Egypt and then taken to various locations and museums, and they were used to record data. So we have narrative storytelling about the history recorded into the faces of these columns. But just think about the Washington Monument and the way that it is also this classical form of architecture, just one single column. And with the Washington Monument, this is not just like a post, like one piece of stone carving this column. This is a skeleton and skin construction. We have a steel structure that has then been sheathed on the outside with stone. But looking back to this entrance here of the tomb of Tutankhamun, we can see on the side here these columns, the structural support for the entrance of that tomb that have been placed there, but they do not look like the Egyptian columns that we were looking at earlier, like in the Temple of Luxor or at the Hatshepsut mortuary temple. These resemble another culture's way of making columns, specifically a culture on the other side of the Mediterranean at the time, the Greeks. And look at the capitals here, the tops of those columns. They look much more like columns we use still in architectural forms today. And the Greeks on the other side of the Mediterranean were making columns for quite an extensive period of time here, and we can see the development as they move across the centuries. The first one being the Doric column, which was the most basic form here, the first one. And as you can see, there's no base. We also have a very basic call or capital at the top here. So there is a carved, smoothly carved top to that column as it meets the structure at the top there, the architrave. So the architrave is a fancy way of saying that lintel. So you have the vertical post with a capital and then the architrave lintel on top of that. The frieze is referring to the decorated part of the column here. Oftentimes carvings are placed onto this frieze. So one lintel will be added, and then another one that has been carved, and then one more above that, which is the cornice, the overhanging one. So you can always identify the cornice by this overhang here on the top of the. As time goes on, we want to get a little bit more decorative. So enter the Ionic column. As you can see with the Ionic column, there is a base. We've started to put a carved base on here to make this more elaborate. We've also changed the capital. So instead of just having a really basic structure on top, we're making a fancy carving to decorate the top of that capital. And we'll talk about some advances in the structure on the top here as well. But the Corinthian is the most recent style of columns. And Corinthian, it's also produced with a base, but really most of what we see happening is this capital here that is carved in much more detail with these acanthus leaves. So just to look at some of those structures again, we have the column, the post, and then the lintel on top, which is the entablature. So the entablature encompasses all of the components we talked about earlier, the architrave being the first lintel that goes across the top, then the frieze, which is decorated and has carvings there, and then the cornice, which is an overhang here. The entablature is also encompassing any roof structure that might appear. So the earliest temples, we just see this flat entablature on top with lintels, and as time goes on and we want to get fancier with our architecture, we'll add a roof here, the pediment, where we also will decorate, place sculptures, which will usually always have a cornice, an overhang on it as well at the very top. So here is a Doric structure that we can still visit today. The earliest form of column that we see here, the Doric column in the Parthenon, that I will also post an extra credit documentary for you concerning, are easily identified because look, there's no base. The column drums meet the base of the temple mount flush, and then when we go up to the capital, we see that the capital itself is just one rounded stone and then one square stone that meets that architrave above it and all of the entablature here. We can see that the original pediment, the roof, was destroyed, but you can still see that there's some sculpture that has been left in the corner there. This would have been full of figurative sculpture at the top here. We have, in the earliest forms, not much decoration on the frieze here. This is just trying to resemble some of the older temples that were built out of wood. But when we look at the Temple of Athena Nike here with Ionic columns, we can see that up in the frieze there is some decorative relief carvings here. So what is identifying this as Ionic is the columns themselves. We have the introduction of the base, so instead of just drums of fluted columns meeting the temple mount flush, It is got a little base at the bottom, but look at the capitals themselves. They have those spiraling volutes on both sides. So it's just two spirals that give us the appearance of those ionic columns. And in this case, up in the pediment, where the roof has also had some damage, there's no sculpture. It's just left blank. But this is a very small temple, much smaller than the Parthenon that we just looked at, that was in the Doric style. The Ionic style is still used in a structure that we're familiar with today, the American White House. So if we look, we can see the bases of the columns peeking out. So that's a clue instantly that it's not Doric, that it's further on in history, that you have these bases, and then up at the capitals we have two spiraling volutes. So this is Ionic. And then Corinthian, this is the most recent style of column in the history of the Greek columns. It is much more detailed. So we have these acanthus leaves carved at the top. When we look at the Corinthian columns, oftentimes that so much detail has been added in that carving, and you've got to think it was very difficult to do this. If you're carving this out of marble, one small error and you break one of these leaves off in your carving. So this was requiring the most technical skill with stone carving to be able to achieve. We still use columns in architectural forms today. In the case of Antoni Gaudi in the 20th century, he did a lot of organic form. We looked at one of his buildings earlier with the roof that was scalloped, but this is Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, that we can see his organic form coming into the design of his columns. So using those classical forms, but then breaking the tops off. Instead of having a capital like in the Greek orders, he's breaking those up to look more like trees, branches of trees in the carving. So all of the examples that we've looked at for post and lintel construction were using stone. It's important to note that you can make a post and lintel structure using other materials like wood. And when we look at some examples from Eastern architecture, China and Japan, we see that wood is very capable as a material for making vertical posts and horizontal lintels, but also employing a variety of woodworking techniques to expand this way of building. The bracket system and using trusses for the roof structure are one way of accomplishing this. So when we see this example here, you have one vertical post, and then on top of it, the capital really is a perpendicular arrangement of brackets. The wood is stacked, and as it moves upward, it starts to expand outward. So you're increasing the surface area that is supported and then passing efficiently all of that force down to the ground through the post. So as we move upward, we can stack these brackets and then start to build trusses that support these long eaves on the roof, like we see here with the Byodo-in Temple in Japan. So being able to have these sweeping eaves coming out by having one post that has brackets, 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 and then extends the support outwards. So it's very efficient and a very different way of building with post and lintel. But the next great advancement that we see with stone architecture as the main material is the round arch and the vault. So what we see with the arch is the creation of the wedge-shaped stone and angled cuts being placed on those stones, so that when you build a column vertically, stacking stones, when you get to the top, instead of having to just place a horizontal lintel over the top of those forms, you can build these stones upward until you reach the keystone at the top and lock it all into place. So this is helping to pass the force down vertically to the ground through the posts through tension and compression. So as those stones' weight press down with gravity, it presses them harder against each other and then makes sure that that structure is going to be sound. So this is allowing us to make very large spaces underneath those arches. And the example of the Pont du Gard here in Nimes, in modern day France, the Romans in the 1st century built a structure that was a viaduct. So it was a bridge that you could transfer goods over, walk over, take a cart over, but also a aqueduct. So this is bringing water from the mountains down to the city, ancient city of Nemesis. I want to draw attention to the large spaces underneath that this arch is capable of creating. So think about what this does for architecture and when we're building structures to live in or have ceremonies in. Instead of having to make a hypostyle hall with many columns to support the roof, you can start to make an arch that will give you a large open meeting area or a tunnel, maybe just an entryway in the form of the Arch of Constantine here in Rome. You might be familiar with a very similar Arc de Triomphe that is in Paris in France, where we also have this very similar classical form. A series of arches that have then been decorated on the surface so that we have all of this detail about the battle that Constantine won in this case. The greatest architectural accomplishment for the arch is arguably the cathedral, which we have many examples still standing in Europe that we can still see this barrel vault. So when you take one arch and extend that through space, you're creating a barrel vault. Underneath you have a gathering area, the nave, which is this structure inside the cathedral. And if we take two of these barrel vaults and intersect them perpendicularly, we have a groin vault. So you can start to see some of these groin vaults that have been created off to the side here, but each one of these has an individual bay. So as you move along the side of the cathedral walls, you have these perpendicular arches creating bays along the side of the nave. In this picture, you can see a little bit better the bays as they move in these groin vaults along the side of the main barrel vault in the Cathedral of Saint Sernin here in Toulouse, France. But this is what signifies the Romanesque period, this arch that we see the Romans come up with. And this is used for centuries up until we have the next great advancement in the construction of the arch. And that was because we found with our architecture that there was only a certain height and a certain distance apart that you could make both of these walls before you would have catastrophic failure and collapse of that barrel vault along the ceiling. So the next great advancement is the pointed arch and vault. So in the Gothic era, that is in the centuries of the Middle Ages, we see a change from the rounded arch to the pointed arch. And this occurs up in the top of the vaulting here. So a pointed vault, instead of having a smooth curvature around, will come up to a point at the top. And this steeper angle allows the force to more efficiently be transferred to the ground through the walls here. This efficiency increase also allowed for less material to be used for the outside walls that were supporting this structure of the cathedral, and we could fill this with stained glass windows. So when we use a pointed arch, up here at the top, not only do we increase the width, how wide the space can be, and how tall this space can be, but we're using less material to construct the walls, and we're able to open those up and include stained glass windows. So this is when the golden age of stained glass comes in, as we saw in the last chapter when we talked about glass with the crafts. So the ability for these pointed arch cathedrals to have less material used to compose the walls themselves was not just due to solely the invention of the pointed arch, but also advances in buttresses. So instead of like the Romanesque cathedrals just having a massive buttress at the base to support those walls from collapsing outward, instead you would have flying buttresses using these piers, which have then arches constructed to make a bridge and support those walls from the outside. So you could build a lot higher due to having this increased support on the outside of the building as well. So the next architectural form that comes out of the creation of the arch, we've seen that if you take an arch and extend it through space, you will create a barrel vault. But if you take an arch and spin it in 360 degrees, you will create a dome. This dome specifically at the Pantheon in Rome has an oculus in the top of it. We can see there's a hole, and this would have been an architectural feat that was very difficult to pull off at the time, and so got a lot of fame because of it. But when we look at the inside of the Pantheon, we can see that oculus provides a lot of light from the outside world, and we have a beautiful dome interior that has this coffering pattern on the inside of it. And this is not just for decoration, as the oculus is. This is so that we can decrease the weight of this dome in stone that has been placed on the roof. Whenever we coffer the inside there, each one of those coffers is subtracting weight from the amount of stone used to construct the dome. So the recesses there called coffering. We talked about the oculus being the hole in the roof. This one has a portico, which is, if you switch that word around, I mean, think it's like where the word porch comes from. But it is a hypostyle construction on the front, much like the Parthenon that we looked at earlier, with a pediment, a roof on top, and then columns that are supporting that structure. But specifically concerning the Pantheon, this is a rotunda. It is rotund, it's round. It is in the form of a cylinder, and then it has this dome on top of it. So the form of the dome meets those walls very well because it is round and it is meeting a round wall below. But what happens if that dome is placed on top of a rectilinear structure instead of a cylindrical structure like this rotunda? In the case of the Hagia Sophia here in Istanbul, this is also originally being built by the Romans. Constantine, the Roman ruler whose namesake the city was originally named for, Constantinople. It is now modern-day Istanbul. At the time of its construction, it was originally a Christian church and was then constructed to, or added on to become an Islamic mosque, as you can see with these minarets that we have on the four corners here that usually denote as an architectural form the Islamic mosque. But when we look at the dome itself, it is similar to the construction of the Pantheon in Rome, but instead of being on a cylindrical base, it's on a rectangular base. And what we see on the inside here are some other forms. We just looked at the minarets, the towers on the outside, but the pendentives are the ones on the interior of this structure that I want to pay attention to here, and that is an architectural form whose only purpose is to serve as a more graceful transfer from that round dome down to this rectilinear base. So the pendentives themselves are these little rounded triangles here that are placed in the corner, and that just smooths out that transition. You didn't have to worry about it with the Pantheon because it was a round dome meeting a round base, but instead of having these awkward corners here where the dome meets that rectangular base, they are covered up with these pendentives. So another type of construction that we want to discuss is corbelling. And this is a similar process of building with stone that we see with the arch, the round arch. But with corbelling, the main difference is that instead of like with the arch, you're angling the cut on the stones and making those move around there. You are stacking with corbelling to make those stones move closer and closer inward until the gap has been closed. So you could make an arch, you could make a barrel vault in this same way, making a tunnel, but you can also make a dome with this method. So in this case, just each row of bricks, you're getting closer and closer together until you close the top of that dome. One structure that you might be familiar with is the Taj Mahal, very famous in India, that's constructed in this same way with corbelling. So when we look up at the top here of the Taj Mahal itself, if you look very closely, you can see that each row of bricks is moving parallel and it's moving closer and closer together until we get to the top of that dome and close it off. This takes us to the revolution that we have occur in the 19th century of cast iron construction. This is the first time that we're producing metal in a high enough quantity during the Industrial Revolution that we can change entirely the way that we're building structures. Instead of building out of stone and having the shell system, we're moving into the skeleton and skin system. So in this case, we're using iron as the skeletal structure of the architectural form, and then we're sheathing it with another material, in this case glass. So this is the predecessor to the modern skyscraper, using both of those materials together. Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace that debuted in 1851 for the World's Fair there is constructed entirely out of iron and glass. So you can imagine when you go to this exhibition and go into this Crystal Palace, so much light would be coming into this form. We're seeing for the first time this skeleton and skin system in effect. This is not a skeleton and skin structure because there is only one material, but built for another World's Fair is the Eiffel Tower, and we're using cast iron also with this structure, where a demonstration of the capabilities of this material, cast iron, and what it's capable of creating. Not just a low structure like the Crystal Palace, but a high tower in the case of the Eiffel Tower here, arguably one of the most famous cast iron structures that we have. As time goes on, we start to advance our chemical science with regard to metals. If we add 1% carbon to that iron, it becomes steel, and it increases the tensile strength and also the capability for that material to be used to create structures that go way higher. So thinking about the Seattle Space Needle in this example, a steel structure that we see debut in 1962 for one of the World's Fairs there. This was a certain romanticism that existed in the 60s with space travel being on the horizon and monorails, new ways of traveling, thinking about extremely tall structures like the Seattle Space Needle was very attractive to people. But as far as an architectural structure, it is 605 feet tall, and you can see from the top there the view that you get being that high up there in Seattle. Steel frame construction, like the Seattle Space Needle here, is the method that we see used to create tall buildings like this in the end of the 1800s through into the 1900s using skeleton and skin. And the first structures that we see, this one by Louis Sullivan in St. Louis, we have a skeleton and skin structure that on the outside, the facade, looks almost entirely like brick and stone. But the structure underlying this is all steel. Then we have a facade that has been added to keep that classical appearance of stone with posts and lintels. We've even got a frieze that is decorated and an overhanging cornice, much like the classical stone architecture of old. But as time progresses, especially in the 20th century, we see international style take over. International style architecture is what we see when we go to urban areas today. Skyscrapers, they are steel in their skeletal form underneath, and then the sheathing, the structure on the outside, is glass. What we see advance from the period when this begins, the end of the 1800s, like the Louis Sullivan building that we just looked at earlier, is that we have much more advancement on the interior of these structures. So the ability for the building to exchange air, keep fresh air coming into the building for people who are working or living inside of it, but also clean water coming in and sewage going out. We have the buildings start to turn into more of an organism, like it functions when we have living things inside of it. So what we begin to see happen is a contest worldwide in the 20th century, who can build the tallest international style skyscraper. And for a while, New York takes the cake, and then Chicago takes over with the Willis Tower, usually referred to as the Sears Tower, along Lake Michigan there. And this just continues to advance. We have changes in the way that these international style skyscrapers are built, thinking about Bjarke Ingels and the advancements that he is making in this style, thinking about the Gherkin here by Norman Foster and Ken Shuttleworth in London, a very different take on the international style. But back to the competition. Shanghai taking over the record in 2008, breaking the record at 2,073 feet for the tallest skyscraper on Earth. And this is not long before we have the record taken over again. Only 2 more years till the Burj Khalifa in Dubai takes over at 2,700 feet, just over. So it's not going to be long until we come up with ways, new materials, or methods for construction that are going to help structures get even taller than this. But for most of us, we live in structures, including myself, in a balloon frame construction, which we start to see come around in the 20th century, where it becomes very popular for being able to build houses, build structures very quickly, especially as we have rising population. Balloon frame construction is also skeleton and skin because you're having 2 main materials. Instead of steel and glass like in a skyscraper, you have wood and then some form of surface on the outside to wrap it with, either aluminum or plastic siding. So this is the way that most houses are built today. Not many of us are living in a stone construction like a hypo-style hall, like a temple or anything like that. We're living in something that is more efficient. So we also want to discuss suspension and cable stay structures because they come up in the chapter, but these are to span distances in the form of bridges. Some of you might have been over this one before, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. You've got a combination in this between a truss system and a suspension system that is using these cables. But with the form here, we can see the piers that are supporting these trusses are used in the shallower areas of the bay, but then we get out into the main channel and we can't get those piers down to the bottom anymore, so it's more efficient to use a suspension bridge. So have cables, two main cables crossing the span there, and then each one of those has individual cables that go down to the deck of the bridge to support it. So what we were seeing there is a truss system and a suspension system. But with the most basic form, it's like post and lintel. We have vertical posts and then horizontal beams that go over to span that gap. That's probably going to work for a small river. But once we have much larger rivers, we have to move into a truss system. So using the strength of a triangle to support that bridge deck as it goes across the span. A stronger way to build a truss system would be to cantilever, so starting to put trusses on the top and the bottom to support the deck of the bridge. You've also probably seen, like on I-70, arches similar to the one here at the top being used to create a bridge, but the biggest bridges are the ones that are using a suspension or a cable stay structure to be able to span those distances. The most famous suspension bridge arguably would be the Golden Gate Bridge, but this was a technique that required a lot of perfecting over the decades when we were starting to build these. You can look up videos of some of the earliest bridges and the catastrophic failures that happened because the supports on this cable stay structure were not doing their job. So as high winds came through the area, the whole deck of the bridge would start to wobble and sometimes even eventually fail. The variation to the suspension bridge is the cable stay bridge, and you can see the differences here. Instead of having two main cables that span the entire distance and then have vertical cables that support the deck of the bridge, the suspension cables are coming from the piers themselves and moving down at an angle to support that bridge. So this one is the Millau Viaduct in France, and this is a bridge that cars are using to span that valley there. So just to compare and contrast here, the suspension bridge, two main cables and then vertical cables going down to the bridge itself, and then the cable stay structure, you have vertical piers with angled cables that are supporting the deck of the bridge. Sometimes we might see cable stay structures being used in architecture non-functionally. So this one just for decoration at the Milwaukee Art Museum by Santiago Calatrava. He's got all this cable stay structure here that is not for a bridge, it's just for aesthetics with the architecture of that building. Reinforced concrete is one more of the innovations that we see revolutionize construction in the 20th century and now into the 21st. Concrete has been used for construction since the time of the Romans, even in the Pont de Garde that we looked at earlier, that was constructed in Nimes, France, as a viaduct and an aqueduct. It's a very strong material, but it doesn't have very much tensile strength. When you add steel structure underneath in the form of rebar, this adds a lot of tensile strength, and we can increase the distance that concrete can span without breaking. So one of those examples that's very famous is the Sydney Opera House that you've probably seen pictures of before. This is all constructed out of concrete, and that concrete has steel bars going up the center of it to give it the strength to be able to make this structure. Another example of that, Arcosanti in the southwest by Paolo Soleri, This one in Arizona, you can see a dome being constructed out of concrete, and that having the ability to have the tensile strength to span the gap. Here's yet one more, the Jubilee Church in Rome by Richard Meyer. All of these giant walls are created out of reinforced concrete. Another ability that reinforced concrete has is to make the cantilevered structure. So this is when we have concrete extending out and not having any vertical posts underneath to support it. You can go see this Frank Lloyd Wright house, Falling Water. It's probably about less than an hour drive from campus, and it is supported by nothing underneath. You just have these overhangs of concrete that have steel going through the structure and supporting them and making sure that they can be able to extend over that little river there and not collapse. So here's a little better picture of those cantilevers of Falling Water here. You can see that there are reinforced concrete cantilevers extending out in this direction and also this direction, and none of those have columns underneath to hold them up. Here's a view looking down into Falling Water at the river there at the bottom. This is another one of Frank Lloyd Wright's architectural forms, Taliesin West here in Arizona. Not using cantilevers, but definitely a very different way of constructing an architectural form. Here's a cantilever that really had to have some extra support here, having these reinforced concrete beams extending up under the underside at the UC San Diego Library here. But a cantilever does not have to be reinforced concrete. If you have an overhang like this, this is also referred to as a cantilever, even though this one is constructed out of steel. Here is a reinforced concrete form, Eero Saarinen here, the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. You've definitely probably seen pictures of this one also, but reinforced concrete. So this is giving Eero the ability to make this large sweeping arch form and have it maintain its strength even with high winds. Another form by Eero Saarinen that you might have seen before or traveled out of is Dulles Airport. We have reinforced concrete being used again to make those large sweeping lines here that we see on the roof. It's one of his signatures, using reinforced concrete and having those sweeping forms. So whether it's the St. Louis Arch or the hockey arena here at Yale, you're using reinforced concrete to make that form. Here's yet another one. This is at JFK in New York. You've got the TWA Flight Center, and this reinforced concrete is no different. You have these large sweeping lines that are strong, and they continue to the inside of the building. So when we look at all of the interior structure here, it reflects those sweeping lines on the outside of the building, and is all being constructed with reinforced concrete. The next architectural form we want to discuss is the geodesic dome, which is a sphere, as you can see here. The first one we have by R. Buckminster Fuller that you can see here is constructed of triangular tetrahedrons, which were modular, so they were all prefabricated, and then whenever they arrive at the site, the crew just starts to put together these individual components that are all exactly the same. So this was a way of construction that took off after the late 60s there. You see them appearing at Epcot, at Disney World here in Florida, but also they don't have to be tetrahedrons or even triangles. This one is using triangles to create an environment on the interior of these greenhouses that is warm enough to grow plants. On the inside, the climate will be temperate and allow plants to grow, even if on the outside the temperatures would not normally permit that. But there's numerous examples of these worldwide greenhouses that can be constructed. This one, each modular component you can see is a hexagon instead of a triangle that's composing the structure itself. But this was popular in the 90s. And movies were created around it, Biodome being one of them, where these two comical characters get trapped inside of a year-long scientific experiment with the scientists and all of the plant life on the inside of a geodesic dome. You might want to check that out if you've got some spare time on your hands. But science really does benefit from these structures in the 21st century. This is the United States South America, or South Pole Station for research, that we have a geodesic dome that has been used to create this base. And what makes geodesic domes so great is not only are they aerodynamic, so when the wind hits it, it's going to fly right over this structure from whatever direction it's coming, but it's also very quick and easy to build. So it took this team a very, very short amount of time to be able to construct this, and it was also very lightweight to be able to transport down to the site. Some of you might have also heard about theories concerning terraforming, like the theory that one day humans could inhabit Mars if we terraformed it by first using geodesic domes to set up temporary bases on Mars, which would be easy and lightweight for rockets to carry there, but also that we could then make the dry ice on the south pole of Mars, which is CO2, create an atmosphere around the Earth, and then unfreeze the liquid water below to be able to start growing crops with. It's an outlandish theory, but may be possible someday, and geodesic domes lend themselves to that scientific exploration because they're easy to set up and also lightweight to transport. So this is leading into a conversation about the future of architecture and how digital design and fabrication techniques will lend themselves to changing our architectural future. It already has started to do that, and at the end of the 20th century, architectural forms like the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao that we've looked at before in the semester by Frank Gehry have taken digital design into their architecture already. This one being designed, or one of the first to be designed, in a digital environment first. So all of these curves that compose the form were mapped out, and then digital machines, digitally controlled machines, can be used to create those components to put this museum together in its final form. You might remember the Bilbao Museum being the site where we saw this this spider here in bronze by Louise Bourgeois. But with Frank Gehry, the designer, the architect of that museum, he also created the bandstand that is down on at the Lakeside Park there in Chicago. If you're ever there, it's right next to the Art Museum, but it's also the park there where we looked at Anish Kapoor's Beam, which is also, if you remember, designed digitally in a CAD environment, and then a machine that is controlled by that digital code is cutting out those components that are then put together. So we're using CNC to be able to create architectural forms. And in this case, the Denver Art Museum is no different. It looks like a spaceship that landed on Earth. All of the normal rules about how architecture should be built with right angles goes completely out the window, as there are next to no right angles in the entire architectural form. And the interior is no different. All of these angles being created in a digital environment first. The computer keeps track of it all, and then whenever it comes time to have a machine cut those parts out to compose the museum itself, you're ready to go and you have a plan. So you can see how many different angles we have here. In the 21st century, materials for architecture can be extended beyond the traditional ones, that being stone and wood, to maybe some materials that you haven't thought of, like fabric. Zaha Hadid here creating a material that can be the walls of this building. Here's another one. We have Shigeru Ban and the use of fabric to be able to compose the entire roof of this form here. And then the understructure has all been created in CAD and then cut out. We can see all of the different hexagons that compose that curvature underneath here. So architecture in the 21st century can really mean anything. Thinking about maybe using inflatable forms to be able to create an architectural dwelling. In this case, this Kengo Kuma tea house that we have in Frankfurt. Architecture, as far as our landscape, we have to think about as creating spaces for human interaction and recreation that really surpass what it has been as far as historical basis in creating buildings. Architecture, creating the way that the landscape looks, really does affect how our lives are lived. And parks and areas that we can get away from our normal dwelling are examples of architecture as well. I want to think about an example that comes up in the chapter with the rural studio here at the University of Alabama, where students are encouraged to try to build architectural forms that are very inexpensive to handle situations with poverty in the United States. Each house has to be under $20,000, and I think this one came in at around $12,000. Architecture being used to address problems in the world and disparities that we see in society is very important. Like Anna Herringer here going to the handmade school, using architectural methods and materials that the community could derive themselves, making the bricks and cutting all of the bamboo to be able to compose the upper level of the structure to make this school in a small rural village in Bangladesh. We also want to discuss green architecture at this point and thinking about ways that as we move into the future, we can create our homes to be more efficient and our workplaces. So sustainability is important. Using less energy, changing the way that our architecture is functioning so that these principles can be in place. This is the Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. This was built from 2000 to 2008, and we have a green structure that is all digitally controlled. So temperature sensors throughout the building tell which windows to open at which time and control the airflow as well as hot and cold so that the building does not have to use hardly any energy to function. Think about green roofs like we just saw at the Academy of Sciences there. Just putting our gardens on the architectural form itself and having a green roof structure that will decrease the amount of energy needed to cool it in the summertime. This is Michelle Kaufman in the Glide House, which is made almost entirely from recycled materials and can then be brought to the site on the back of a truck at very little cost. The Institute for Advanced Architecture in Madrid, Spain here is creating a green architectural form that produces more energy than it uses. What we can see are curved solar panels that line the entirety of the roof, and we even have water heating tanks up here that use solar energy to be able to heat the water that they're using in this structure. So just thinking about the materials that we're using, being able to use things that are recycled, the projects around the Earthships in New Mexico, government land that is available for people to experiment with green architecture is available. They will give it to you, and then you can go and start building your structure. In this case, tires, cans, and bottles are used to be able to create this green architectural form. And the interior is quite impressive. If you look it up on YouTube, you can see a lot of these construction methods in action. But here is yet another Earth ship in New Mexico where we have a hybrid living situation and greenhouse. So they're growing crops inside of here, living in the greenhouse, keeping their warmth from the solar radiation coming through all of those windows, and then coming up with methods for recycling their water, using the water that's coming off of waste to be able to fertilize and also water the plants, especially in an arid environment like we have in New Mexico. They're not getting a lot of rain. So this is the garden on the interior, tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, what have you, being readily available. Just walk down from your living room and pick some fresh produce. Reminds me a lot of the Hobbit holes, which also is a way of architecture that we see in the American North, where it's very cold. We find people building houses that are under mounds so that in the summertime, the temperature of the earth, the ground that surrounds you is keeping you cool, and in the wintertime, it's keeping you slightly warmer than it is outside. So you maintain a constant temperature, being insulated by the ground itself. Bjark Ingels again here, a concept for New York City apartment building that I think now has been realized. Again, all digitally controlled. So we've got windows that are going to be able to open up on digital command depending on the temperature. This is the final form here. You can see that it's not only interesting as far as the form itself, but it's also using very little energy to accommodate all of these people that are living inside. So just as a reminder, look for the Secrets of the Parthenon documentary link underneath this lecture, and you will get an in-depth look into the project that is going on restoration-wise at the site of the Parthenon in Greece, and the intricacies of this ancient wonder of the world. And I'll catch you guys next time.